Everyone. Welcome to the Behind the Hire podcast. Today, joined with Carson, the founder of Vyynl. So, Brian, thanks for being here. And I'm
Sure.
excited. I'm excited to hear a little bit more about your company and your journey. So, would you mind just telling everyone a little bit about Vyynl and what you do?
So Vyynl is a mix of different things, right? Where we started much more facilitating education in that space. We do our bread and butter is visual branding, right? And by the means of visual branding, we reinvent corridors, hallways, doors, floors, so on and so forth. So heavily design based. And we have an education component where we mentor young students and kids from backgrounds, grades, let's say three all the way up to high school, and understanding what we do as a company, how we do it, and why we do it. And so, to year to date, we've worked with about 2 dozen plus public schools in New York City. So that's something that's our biggest mission, and we're ultimately excited to start rolling out the second phase of our company, which is a digital tech platform that connects all of the different parts of signage from installation, design, project management, and sales together in one place and giving people, day-to-day people, the opportunity to work with us with no prior history in signage or any whatsoever have you, similar to what Uber did with driving, right? And so we want to create that new disruption in our industry because we think that is necessary. And we see that it's lacking in that area.
That's awesome that you came up with this and you put it into action. So, let's get into your career journey a little bit. So
Sure.
looking back on your career, what experiences do you think most shaped the way you think about leadership today and just how you build relationships?
A great question. I am one half of Vyynl. I'm a co-founder. Our other founder, Richard Ellie. Uh, when he brought the idea to me quite some time ago, I probably was 23 or 24 when he brought the idea to me. And I think at that point, him and I had a mentor-mentee relationship, right? And so the company kind of was built off of him and I mirroring one another and identifying, the things that he could teach me, the things that I could then in turn teach back to him. And so when you mention leadership, I think it started from there, right? Him having 20 plus years of experience in sales and giving me an idea of him showing me I was naturally gifted at sales. So through his leadership, I then became a leader in my own right. And then we developed this company and built this team of people that are on the same mission, on the same goal, have the same vision. For me, and how I see leadership and how leadership was invoked in me was essentially, where are you trying to go? What does it look like? And how much people can you help along the way? And if that's what I think leadership is, right? Leadership is not about who's right and who's wrong. Leadership is about getting the job done, right? So that's how I would sum it up.
Do you think the fact that, you were a co-founder and you had a partner in this whole process made things a lot easier? Was, were there any challenges that came with that? I'd love to hear a little bit more about that.
Great question. There are challenges, right? I mean, there's challenges when you're doing something hard.
Yes,
Once you set out
for
to do
sure.
something hard, there's always challenges, right? So I
100%.
think you 100%. I think the biggest thing when having a co-founder is when you set out to do something together. I think if I was giving advice to anyone that has a co-founder who wants to start on a journey of building a company and entrepreneurship, you want to identify how your partner and yourself communicate, right? Everyone learns differently and everyone speaks differently with one another. Some people are more visual, some people are more audio, some people like to write things down, right? So I think number one, as far as setting an anchor, a basic foundation, you and your partner do a lot of exercises to determine how you communicate and what certain things mean to you. For example, there's an exercise I do with the team, and the exercise goes, how do you make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? You would think, right, that everyone makes a peanut butter and jelly sandwich the same way. It's simple.
You would, yeah.
But yeah, but I like to toast my bread first. And while I'm toasting my bread,
It's true.
I get the jelly and I put the jelly first, but you might do it differently. I cut it like this on an
Yeah.
angle. Some people cut it
Like it's
straight through the
straight
middle.
down the
You see it? Right,
middle.
exactly. So you see how interesting that exercise is, right? And so I
Yeah,
think that's like the first anchor in developing, co-founder or founder or building a team, right? Just identifying how people think and how people want to be approached when they're learning new things.
yeah.
Right. So I think that's the first thing. And so secondly, it helps tremendously to have someone that can take on the burden of heavy thinking. Because thinking is not easy sometimes, right? Especially when you're creating something that may or may not exist. So I think that's essentially where that's my answer. So one, determining an effective way to communicate consistently. And secondly, just prioritizing who does what when. But it helps.
I think that's also a point of like specialization. Another
Right.
person might have, skills that complement yours and, you could just work
Hmm.
together and, figure everything out.
Right.
Um,
Exactly. Exactly.
yeah. So every, founder has, a point in their career when their business is just an idea. So at what point did your, business become more than an idea and you actually, took the leap of faith, get started rather than just keep on talking about it?
Mm. You know, I think it wasn't as it might not have been one thing per se, but it was a series of things, I
Right.
think. Right. And I think the one pivotal thing that changed everything was getting access to the Department of Education. You
Yeah.
know, yeah,
Yeah.
because prior to gaining access to the Department of Education and learning how to do business with the city of New York, we were doing B2B commercial, right? Door-to-door sales, which is a tremendous aspect of doing things, right? And to this day, we do 90% of our sales door to door. We still do it the same way. But gaining access to the Department of Education shifted things because we became more organized as a organization, right? We were working for ourselves, Richard and I as founders, and kind of trying to create this idea of Vyynl and this culture between him, him and myself. But then when we shifted to working with the Department of Education, we realized that we needed a little bit more of an organization in play in order to sustain the amount of value that we were generating with schools, right? So I think the pivot came in from identifying that there was a need for what we wanted or need for what we have. There was a growing client base, so scale was happening. And then there were people that were specializing in parts of the system or the pipeline that could come in and help, right? At one point in time, I was doing sales, I was doing project management, I was doing print production management. It's so much different facets of the job that I was doing personally myself. And then eventually we realized that bringing people in that were better at those things than I was
Yeah.
created an organization, right? It's a big difference between entrepreneurship, self-employment, being a businesswoman or being a businessman, and I think we as industry, as a community, when you talk about developing a business, we kind of put everything in one bucket, but they vary so much, right? And you realize that entrepreneurship first is the idea of creating this new thing and trying to find, proof of stake, an audience that you can service. But then when you have a business, businessman or businesswoman indicates now you're at the level of trying to create a system around this idea, right? And you are responsible for others and you're responsible for their growth. You become a leader, right? And so there are two different skill sets that both Rich and I had to learn. And so now here we are today, still learning, still loving the journey. But I think yeah,
Yeah.
that's ultimately where the shift came when even easier put, said Jeremy, right? We became an organization when we had to serve a big organization.